thank you for the invitation to give the talk in the first place. I'm always happy to talk about ducks. There is a duck involved. It's actually a rubber chicken, because I couldn't find a rubber duck which squeaked in the same way this one squeaks. But we will see what we can do to build a computer out of something like this. We need to talk about what computers look like, okay? And I don't mean physically, I mean kind of logically. How do they work? How do they process information? And they generally process information using Boolean logic, okay? We all use Boolean logic day to day without realizing it. It's just been captured and formalized mathematically into a variety of things. We can build electronic circuits out of them, which is what we do, and what I teach in first year. What we have are these are called logic gates. And if we have some kind of logical input, so that's a true or a false signal. So for example, I like cats, and a statement like, I like dogs. These are two statements which are either true or false in this hypothetical world where you can't be ambivalent. We can pass them into one of these gates, and it will combine them in some way to give us an output. Okay? So the top one here, come on, there's plenty of students in the room. What's the top one? There we go, it's an OR gate. It says it here. And the second one? It was an AND gate, absolutely. And the bottom one? It was a NOT gate, absolutely. So what these do is combine these logical signals in some capacity to produce a new signal. If it's an OR gate, if either of those two inputs are true, the output will be true. If A or B is true, the output is true. If it's an AND gate, they both have to be true for the output to be true. A and B need to be true. And if it's a NOT gate, it's only one input, and it just swaps it. Not true is false, and vice versa. So this is how we then construct a computer. And what we need is we need this one at the bottom here, the NOT gate, and one of these two, and we can do any logical function in the world. Anything you can come up with, we can express in Boolean logic. We can combine them to solve that problem, to implement that function. Okay? And this is what's called a universal set. So this is how we generally build computers, is we start to hook these up, and we usually use computers to do this because it's very complicated, and we wire them together to solve whatever function it is we want to solve. Now, I've called this conventional computing because this is not what I do. But it is related, so bear with me. We can't build ducks into this, unfortunately. This is what they generally look like. Or at least this is a diagram of what they look like. What we have in here is basically just a switch, which, when you provide some signal to it, redirects some electrons somewhere else, so you get some different output. Second and third years, can anyone work out what logic gate this is? This is a NOT gate. You can tell, because there's only one input. But anyway, this is how computers are built. Right? These are physical devices which basically just redirect electrons around different cables and wires and things like that, and they bump into each other in certain places. And that is how things compute in modern, boring silicon CMOS technology. I do not work with this. However, it's important to realize that this is a physical substrate. There are physical things in here. There are electrons moving around which we are trying to guide. There are charges, there are currents, there are voltages. And we can reason about what computing is when we take this into account. So this is a diagram from a friend of mine, Susan Stepney, who's a professor at York, and some of the work she did with Dom Horsman and a couple of others, where they were trying to reason about, well, at what point does something start to compute? When does it stop just doing what it's doing, and when does it start actually computing? Because transistors will, well, they won't transist. They'll continue to do what they do all the time as soon as you provide current to them. When do they start actually computing? And what they reason about is that there is some dashed line between the abstract problem you're trying to solve and the physical substrate underneath it. So if you have some problem in your brain which you want to solve, let's say you have two binary symbols, 0, 1 and 1, 0, 2-bit strings, and you want to add them together. Well, as all the students in the room should be able to tell you, that will add up to 1, 1. 2 plus 1 is 3. In our world, and the way we think about things, well, we apply some of these logic gates in a particular sequence using an adder to produce the answer. But in reality, what's happening is we are encoding these into voltages in a particular way, storing electrons in a particular pattern. We then set it all up in such a way that when we let physics do its thing, they all collide into each other, and we move forward in time. Somewhere over here, we get some different arrangement of electrons, which we interpret as the answer. Essentially, we think of it as doing this. In reality, we're doing this. Make sense? Vaguely. So what I focus on is, what else could be this? If this is how this works, we don't need to use silicon CMOS technology. We could use anything, provided we have some way of encoding our problem in it, and it evolves through time in some way that we get some meaningful answer out at the other end of it. The reason we use silicon CMOS technology is because it's really quite efficient for us to build them. We've put a lot of money behind the manufacturing of them, the fabrication of them. So now it's very efficient for us to produce. Doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. And actually, we're hitting the limits, really, of what we can do with silicon, because we're right down at that kind of nanometer technology. We're running out of space. We can't get much smaller. So it's time to look at different areas. For example, there we go. So this is a small video. Some of you will have seen it before. This is a chemical reaction. This is the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction. As you can see, it's changing color. It kind of fluctuates and oscillates between this kind of reddish-brown and blue on a time scale of 20 to 30 seconds. And my glamorous assistant is going to put a little bit of silver wire in the side of it here. Now, silver acts as a catalyst for this particular reaction. Anyone who's studied chemistry knows what a catalyst does. What does it do? Speeds up a reaction. Except it's only really touching it here. So only this little bit here is being sped up, and then the rest is going at its normal rate. So it's just kind of pushing it out of sync with the rest of the reaction. Yeah? So what we can see, or at least hopefully you can see, around where we've kind of given it a poke, we start to see these waves propagating out from where we've stimulated it. Yeah? Well, why can't we consider that to be an input? Why can't we start encoding data into the presence or absence of waves of this chemical reaction? We can then collide these waves together to perform computation, solve problems. So this is the field of unconventional computing. This particular field is something called reaction diffusion chemistry. So, going back to our good friend, the logic gate, if we have two inputs in a chemical reaction, we've got a nice flat chemical reaction, and we poke it with the wire just once, here or here, the wave will propagate along the channel we've made out for it, and it will collide, or not collide, with a wave coming the other way. Anyone work out what gate this will implement?
OR gate.
Sorry?
OR gate.
OR gate, 10 points. This is an OR gate. So regardless of which one you put here, whichever one you stimulate, you're going to get something on the output. It's implementing this OR functionality, and you can probably guess what this is going to do. AND gate. Yeah. This is a 2-input gate, and I've shown you 3 gates, 2 of which are 2 inputs, and there's one other. This is an AND gate. The way this works is slightly different. If one of these comes in, it'll just go straight past. If both of them come in, they will collide in the middle, and the chemical concentration will be higher, which means it will propagate further into the blue bit, which I'm kind of skimming over the details of what the blue bit is, and it will then stimulate this bit, and it will be able to produce an output. Now, I'm not allowed in a chemistry lab for various reasons, so I don't go into a chemistry lab and do this. I cheat, and I use some really horrible-looking maths to simulate the behavior of these waves. How do they actually move? How quickly do they move? How do they interact with each other? We're basically simulating the chemical concentrations. Now, this is quicker, easier, a hell of a lot safer than going into a chemistry lab, especially if I'm involved. And we can go all the way to the point of building gigantic circuits like this one. Here's one I prepared earlier. This is a simulation of a neural network which has stored some information into some memory, and we're recalling that memory. It's an associative memory. Great. We've done some complicated things which absolutely would never make it into real chemistry. This is stupid. This is a very stupid way of looking at unconventional computing, as every computer scientist is probably thinking in the back of their head now. Why on earth have we got something very, very efficient, silicon CMOS technology, which does it in this way really well? And then we've gone, all right, let's see if we can do it in this really slow chemical reaction. How are we going to do it? Well, we're going to ignore the fact that it's a chemical reaction, and we're just going to try and do the same thing and build logic gates again. We're going to ignore the fact that it has its own dynamics, that a chemical reaction will just react with whatever we put in it and can do a hell of a lot more interesting stuff than build logic gates. Fortunately, recently, the field of unconventional computing has realized maybe this is a good idea. Maybe we shouldn't just build logic gates into everything. Don't get me wrong, there are still some who are going down that road, but they'll come around. So what we have now is kind of a shift in the unconventional computing field. Previously, everyone was building logic gates and generally being sneered at by most of computer science because it is stupid. And we have kind of modern unconventional computing, which takes a very different tack. It says, let's take whatever substance we want to use and let it just be that substance. Let's not torture it to be a computer. We just let it evolve through time, and it will maybe not perform every function, but it will perform some functions which may be useful. So it's getting away from the idea of general purpose computing towards special purpose computing. We're not going to be running a spreadsheet on what I'm going to show you today, but that's fine. We can run a spreadsheet on these. We don't need a new way of running spreadsheets. To be fair, we have too many spreadsheets as it is. But what we are going to have is ways of doing interesting monitoring and smart sensors in sort of distant remote areas. That's the main sort of target we're going to be focused on. This is where the duck is going to make an appearance. Briefly, I need to introduce a new computing model. This is a reservoir computer. Well, it's not. That's a complete lie. This is a diagram which represents a reservoir computer. It looks kind of messy and complicated. Let me walk you through what's going on here. We have some reservoir in the middle here. Think of this as a bucket of water. Okay? You have a bucket of water filled with water. And it's nice and still. It's just sat on the table. No one's kicked it over recently, so it's just settled down. And you walk over to that bucket of water, and you go on the side of the bucket. What's going to happen? Yeah, you'll get some ripples. Something will happen. So you've given it a fairly low-dimensional input. That's a pretty low-dimensional input. And then you've got a whole load of ripples. So they are what I would call a projection of that input into a higher dimensional space. There is a lot more going on in those ripples. If we could wind back time, we could work out where it started from. It'll mostly be chaotic for a lot of it, but that's fine. Chaos is fun. That is our reservoir. It is this big bucket of water, and what we do is we kind of kick it in different ways. Depending on how hard you kick it, what the reservoir is going to do, what the water is going to do. And it's going to bounce off the sides and combine with itself and do interesting things. Mathematically speaking, for those of you who care about these things, it's a random kernel. Okay? It's just doing a big projection into high-dimensional space. But that's good, because if we have stuff in a high-dimensional space, we can learn pretty much anything. Famous theorem from Thomas Cover back in the day, which is the basis for why neural networks work so well. If you go into a high enough dimensional space, you can solve pretty much any problem. So again, we have a way of solving pretty much any problem, much like we did with the logic gates. It's just a different kind of solving. This is particularly well suited to kind of temporal signals, temporal problems, because you have some kind of delay in there, you have some kind of combination from previous signals. The first knock you give it is maybe going to be combined with a little bit of the second knock, and so on and so forth. Make sense? Great. What we then do is just pick the bits of the ripples which we want. Okay? To solve the problem we want to solve, we say, okay, I'll have a little bit of that bit there, a little bit of that bit there, and a bit of that bit there, and if I add them up in this way, it solves the problem. It's a fairly standard linear regression problem, trivial to do for a computer. Here's where the fun bit starts. What if we put a duck in there? or a rubber chicken, for that matter. Could we then use something which is not a bucket of water, something which is not a neural network like that is, to solve a problem? Well, let's try it out. Now, ethics won't let me bring a live duck in and do this, so I have a rubber chicken. That, and to be fair, it would peck the hell out of me if I had a live duck trying to do this, because what we're going to do is the same thing we did to that bucket of water. We're going to give it a stimulus. We're going to give it a stimulus. This is our reservoir. So we're going to give it an input signal. If we squeeze it gently, and if we squeeze it hard, different. Nice. Non-linear. If we squeeze it multiple times in a row, this is our reservoir. We can now take the bits of that high-dimensional squawk to solve the problem we want, provided we have a way of encoding our signal into these. This is why ethics wouldn't let me do it. And we have a way of decoding from that squawk into an answer we have. We can go down, across, and up in that diagram we saw at the beginning. We can encode. We let time do its thing. Physics does its thing. The duck does its thing. And then we decode from the output. OK, great. Question half of you are probably asking, maybe more, why? More importantly, how do you get the right duck? Which is a non-trivial question. Because maybe some ducks are better than other ducks. You've got a problem. Maybe a duck is the good solution to your problem. I don't mean like in therapy. I mean a computing problem. Maybe a duck is the solution to your problem. How do you know which duck to use? Ducks squawk differently. They walk differently. How do you decide this is the right duck for me, for my problem? Well, let's play that out. What would we do? Let's say you have these two ducks in your universe, and you want to decide which duck is the duck for your problem. How do you decide between these two ducks? In a rigorous way, not in an arbitrary, ooh, I like the look of that one kind of way. Well, maybe what we do is we go and we find a whole load of both of them. And maybe we define some metric of how they squawk. Maybe the volume, maybe the length, whatever else you want to say about them. And maybe we then squeeze a whole load of them, and we measure all of these things, and we can maybe characterize, okay, this is the kind of problem which this duck is well suited to, because it has a particularly long squawk, and we need a long squawk. And maybe we plot them like this, and you can say, okay, we can see some differences between the two types of duck. So we've just gone and squeezed about 10,000 ducks in the hope that we can understand which is the right duck for our problem. Less than ideal. This is basically the approach which reservoir computing took up until recently. And we define some metrics. These are reservoir computing metrics. We won't go into details. They're basically things like how well does the input kick produce certain types of output, is what we're really after here. So we could do this. This would take a very long time. You'd probably get pecked at quite a lot. You probably wouldn't like ducks very much by the end of it. It's probably not the best way of doing it. But more importantly, there are hundreds of species of duck. We've only looked at 2, and we've already lost 2 fingers. How many fingers have you got left to check the other species of ducks? Maybe, after we've realized all of that, maybe we've realized actually what we need is something up here, and neither of these ducks will do the trick. We need to find a duck species which will fill in this space here. Well, we go and we keep looking. We keep finding ducks, we keep squeezing ducks. None of them are ticking the box. Shucks. I haven't said shucks in about 15 years. Probably for good reason. Did it translate? I don't think it did. So, okay, maybe one of those would work. But this all seems a bit like guesswork. Brute force, if you like, if you're a computer science-minded person. We're basically brute forcing the solution. We're looking at every possible option instead of thinking a bit more cleverly about it. So let's think a bit more cleverly about it. Let's say what we actually wanted, for the sake of argument and because I know what the next slide is, we wanted a bit of the mallard from here and a bit of the ruddy shell duck from here. Maybe we wanted the kernel rank of the mallard, the generalization rank of the ruddy shell duck. But we can't get them in the same duck. Well, you're going to see some fantastic Photoshop skills in a minute. What if we could design our own duck? What if we could take the ruddy shell duck and carefully graft on the head of our mallard? Maybe this would solve our problem. Well, when we come into physical reservoir computing, which is what we're talking about here, this idea of using blobs of stuff in the world to do computing in this model, this is feasible. It's just really bloody difficult for any substrate. So we do a lot of work with sort of magnetic rings, with carbon nanotubes, with magnetic spin ice, with a whole load of different technologies, all of which have different requirements. Some of them need to be kept close to zero in terms of temperature. Some of them need to be kept away from magnetic sources. Some of them are just a pain in the arse in general, no matter what you want to do. Bloody carbon nanotubes, they just change. Anyway, interfacing with one of these is difficult enough. What we are trying to do here is try and say, okay, well, we not only want to interface with one of them, we want one of them to talk to another one of them. So you have carbon nanotubes next to a magnetic ring, which you need to keep sufficiently separate, otherwise they interfere with each other, and you want to get a signal from this one into this one and out the other side of it. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And so we kind of hit a wall. And we said, all right, maybe we can't design our duck, but this is something called multi-reservoir systems. Can we grow a duck? Ducks grow. They lay eggs. Carefully move a bit of this egg into this egg. Maybe that's a way of doing it. Maybe we can grow the reservoir we want with the properties we want. You know, CRISPR is fairly easy to mess around with. We can mess around with the genome. Maybe we can grow something which has the properties we want. Now, growth is a whole other kettle of fish. I don't mean that literally in this case. It is, for the sake of definition, a whole bunch of different processes within the body. Okay? So it's not the sake of growth is not just getting bigger. It is cell division, cell differentiation, so what the cell becomes. Morphogenesis, what shape do you grow into? So how does a hand become a hand? Maintenance, so if you cut yourself, it repairs itself eventually, provided you don't do it too much. Some kind of adaptation, so everything around actually getting stronger or getting fitter, or the opposite, that is all adaptation, that is all still growth. Apoptosis, so cell death, when you're actually aging, this is all part of growth as well. These are all the natural processes of the body's growth mechanisms. Can we take some of these and harness them in some way to grow reservoirs which can solve problems which we can't find ducks to solve for us? Okay? Now, when it comes to growth, it's really a non-trivial problem, because we only really have a basic understanding of how growth and the growth processes work within our body. We understand it from the perspective of, you know, molecules interacting with this, but actually there's a lot more going on when they are growing than we really are aware of. There's a lot of feedback loops and things like transcription factors which change the way things are expressed, and a whole load of messy stuff which we don't entirely understand, which is going on. But I'm a computer scientist, not a biologist, so I'm just going to pretend none of that exists and see if we can build a model anyway. So this is a cellular automata. That's a lie. This is a picture of two cellular automata. The one on the left is what we call an elementary cellular automata. So that has one spatial dimension and one temporal dimension. So you can think of it as being a bunch of cells across here with different states, 0 or 1. And at each point in time, going down, we apply this rule at the top here. So we look at the neighbors, and we look at ourselves, and we look it up in here, so that's going to be white, black, white, this one here. And it tells us what this should be in the next step. Make sense? And so we can then see the progression over time of this particular system. Okay, so we've got time going downwards, space going sideways. And we already see some really interesting properties coming out of it. These are called Sierpinski triangles, which emerge over time in this particular rule. Conway's game of life. It's a very famous mathematical game produced by John Conway back in the, I want to say 1970 or so. Originally, it was laid out on a Go board, and they just came up with some rules, and they had the rules which were basically, if there are too many around you who are alive, you should die from overcrowding. If there are too few of you around who are alive, you should come to life. A couple of other ones, a fairly simple rule set. And what he found was you got these really interesting emergent properties. This is called a glider gun. And it's just producing this glider which just works its way across the space. It just walks along, just based on these rules. It's completely deterministic. You just got to set it up in the right way. And he found this on the Go board before computers were easy enough to work with to see something like this. And they happened to find the glider, which is one of these little walking things, on a Go board as it was making its way across as they were just applying the rule over and over again. Fascinating idea. People are still researching this and still finding interesting things out of it. These are both Turing complete in some capacities for different rules. Not that anyone cares about Turing completeness. So this is a cellular automata. This is the model we're going to use. We're going to try and look at growth and morphogenesis in a cellular automata. Okay? And we're going to cheat and use a neural network. So, whereas these have a set rule, which we are going to handcraft, because it's the 70s and that's the only capacity we have, we're doing it on a Go board, so they handcraft these rules, and change them and try and work out what's happening. It is no longer the 70s. We're going to use a neural network instead of this update rule. Because a neural network just learns any function. Whatever function you give it, you can tell it to learn that function. So we're going to tell it to learn an interesting function. This is a video of what happens when we do that. In this case, a gecko. What's even more interesting is we can rub a bit of it out. Turn it back on. Hey presto, it heals. Much like many real animals. So these were originally inspired by the planarian, which is a weird worm, for lack of a better word, which you can chop it into something like 250 pieces, and it will still grow into 250 separate worms. What's really interesting is you can chop its head off after teaching it something, and it will regrow a new brain and a new head with the same memory that you taught it before. Really cool. We also look at things like the axolotl, I can never pronounce that word. The weird sort of childlike looking gecko salamander thing with the gills. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of it. If not, well, Google it, it's quite cute. They also can regrow limbs, or you can graft limbs onto them, and then they can start using them, and they will just adapt them, and things like that. So these are the kind of properties we're after. And this is a way of studying that in an artificial system. So while these are able to regrow, we just saw a second ago, if we chop bits off of them, what if we can co-opt these kinds of things into new areas? But we also have now a way of studying growth, and a way of studying, in an artificial sense, what happens when we start messing around with the genome, when we start messing around with what happens as it's growing. Something which we can't easily do with animals because biology is messy and horrible and difficult. Computers are easy. We just throw more compute power at it. We can stop it and just rub it out. Can't easily do that with animals. For example, what happens if we mess around with the genome, the data in that initial seed cell? We can get it to grow a different number of legs. Much the same as you would do if you start messing around with the genome of the duck. Although we don't know enough about the genome of the duck to really be able to do something to this extent. But this is a simpler model. So just by encoding into 4 different parts of that seed cell some different information, we managed to get it to grow every possible combination of legs. We can also do other things. So we can take a fully grown one of these and train it to respond to external signals. Let's grow one. Give it a poke. Hey, it changes color. Look at that. We can keep on doing this, and it will keep on responding. So in this case, I think I did it 100 times? Yeah, roughly 100 times. And it keeps on responding over and over again, much like any animal would do. Okay? And it's being poked in a slightly different place every time as well, just for the sake of clarity there. It's not just growing a new one over the top of it. So we have a model now of some kind of growth mechanism, which we may be able to co-opt to solve computer science problems. but also allow us to answer questions about biology and morphogenesis and a variety of interesting things over on that side. One of the questions we asked is, because these are trained purely based on local interaction, so cell-to-cell interaction, much like our bodies. One of the questions which we might want to ask is, how come our body knows that if I go up and touch something, that thing is not me? This idea of self-awareness, this idea of self, not self-discrimination, which the immune system is a key part of. If you do that in this model, the basic model, bad things happen to the gecko. This is not a happy gecko going on over here. This has got, well, a hell of a lot of bad things going on. Eventually, I think it just dies out completely. Because it just doesn't know about other organisms. So it doesn't know what to do when you do that. It turns out, if you ask it to just remember a number, that's enough to get rid of this problem. And we can study then what happens at a cellular level when things are interacting. So in this case, it turns out that one of them just shuffles away from the other one. We haven't told it to do that. It just did that because it was just trying to be a full gecko. So this model of morphogenesis is now giving rise to movement which has never been programmed in. It's what we call an emergent property. And it doesn't just do it like this. It does it any kind of which way it can to try and make itself into a full gecko. So we can study growth. We have a model of growth. We have a model of morphogenesis, this idea of how do you create a shape. And we can then start to play around with manipulating it to get certain things out of it and get it to respond to certain things. Can we bring all of this background to then try and grow that duck, to grow the reservoir, to do computation, to compute things? That's the question. Fortunately, I had a particularly talented undergraduate student last year who solved this using this here. This is something called the developmental graph cellular automata. I feel like there should be a fanfare when I say that. Messy pipeline, won't go into the detail. What it does is it grows graphs. So instead of growing into a particular shape on a grid, like we saw before, it does the same thing, but it's away from the grid. It's now in a graph. So it can grow a graph which has any particular property or shape we want. And what we did was we said, okay, grow us graphs which can solve this problem if we treat you as a reservoir. So we have a model of growth which can grow a reservoir now. Turns out it outperforms, substantially outperforms normal reservoirs under the same conditions. Hardly surprising, because we've told it to be good at it. What was really interesting is it didn't use as many nodes, so it actually did it more efficiently than the standard approach. And even more interesting is what it grew, which looks more lifelike than most graphs I've ever seen. Some of the properties we've been still picking apart what it grows and why it grows them. Some of these are kind of motifs you would see in nature. You know, pairs of things inhibiting each other, cross inhibition, self-loops, kind of copied motifs across an entire backbone, similar to what you'd see in sort of a DNA strand. We're still trying to work out why it's picked these particular ones, kind of ongoing research. What was interesting is that the standard reservoir and the sort of prevailing theory is that you just need loads and loads of nodes, all randomly connected. That's the way to get the best out of this. And this just blows it out of the water completely. What we need is structure, because the brain is not random. The body is not random. It hasn't grown into a random shape. It is a particular shape, and it is that shape for a reason. A good example, which I'm going to steal from someone called Robin Heisinger, based in Berlin. He wrote a very good book called The Self-Assembling Brain. In there, he gives a good example of the monarch butterfly. So the monarch butterfly lives in North America. And it lives up in the north, in sort of Canada area, fairly cold. And at a certain point, it gets too cold, and they migrate down to sort of Mexico area. And they go down to a really small space, sort of 1-2 square kilometers, from across all of Canada. Okay? And then they mate, they do their thing. And then after a few weeks of sunning themselves and drinking pina coladas and whatever else it is that they do in Mexico, they all start to fly back again. But they don't fly all the way back to Canada. They fly to around Texas, where they settle down, and they lay their eggs, and they die. And then the next generation are born. And then they fly north. And they get to maybe New York. And they do the same thing. And then they lay their eggs. And then they die. And then their next generation wake up and make it all the way back up to Canada, who then lay eggs and die. And the next generation wake up and go, you know what? I need a holiday. And they go back down to Mexico again, to that same place in Mexico that their great-great-great-great-grandparents went to. Now, they're not communicating that GPS signal to their great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. They're not writing it down. They're not passing it down through generations. It is encoded into their brain. They know where to go because they've grown a brain which tells them where to go. They've not learnt it by studying thousands and thousands of images of maps like we currently train AI models to do. The shape is what matters. And that's why this research gets really interesting, because there is no learning going on inside this. It is just shape. The dynamics of the entire reservoir are driven by the way it has grown. So we can get it to solve problems purely through shapes. Complete opposite of what we're doing in AI at the moment, which is you have a fully randomly connected or fully connected network, randomly initialized, and then you train the hell out of it with months and months of compute time, destroying the planet as we go. This is the complete polar opposite of that. That's why it's super exciting for me, because I really love winding up AI people. That's not true. It's not just AI people. So, to conclude, because I'm conscious of time, spoiler alert, you probably would have guessed this at the beginning. Yes, we could build a computer out of a duck. It's just not necessarily the best way to build a computer. But in so doing, it led us down a path which led us some really interesting ways of thinking about computation and AI. And to be fair, anything with a fading memory and some kind of nonlinear projection we can build a computer out of. It just won't be very good at things. The real question is, can we grow computers? Yes, we can. And that is super exciting to me. Thank you.